So, here's a story that I've been holding in for a while, but it feels like time to get it off my chest. I, 32F, have a father in his 60s and he's been married to his wife. We'll call her Sasha, who's in her 40s, for almost a decade now. I was already a full-fledged adult by the time she came into our lives, so I never really thought of her as any kind of mother figure. That was fine by me. And to be honest, she was pretty nice most of the time. She could be a bit much, but overall, no major issues, at least at first. Now flash forward a few years and I have a husband, 34M, and 2 kids, my son who's 9, and my daughter who just turned 4. Sasha has always been especially taken with my daughter, to the point where it quickly started to feel overwhelming. I've always respected Sasha's enthusiasm, but it reached a level where my husband and I decided we had to start setting boundaries. To her credit, she mostly respected them, or at least pretended to, but I guess she never quite got what we were asking, or maybe she just didn't care. Anyway, at the start of this year, my dad and Sasha decided they wanted to take a trip to Disney World and invited us along. The timing seemed perfect, since we could use the trip to celebrate my son's birthday. I had high hopes this would be a great family trip for all of us, especially since it would be my son's first time there. But as soon as we arrived, it was pretty clear that Sasha had her own ideas about how things were going to go, and those ideas revolved almost entirely around my daughter. It started with a tea. Sasha had bought herself one of those mini mouse ear tiaras and seemed pretty set on my daughter wearing one to match. My daughter wasn't interested at all, though. She's not into tiaras and actually preferred a Donald Duck hat, which I bought for her instead. But Sasha wasn't going to let that go. She got her the tiara anyway, and then seemed genuinely upset when my daughter refused to wear it. Things only got worse from there. Throughout the trip, Sasha went on these shopping sprees, spoiling the kids despite us asking her not to. My husband and I didn't want to overpack our bags, and we'd planned some shopping ourselves, so I thought I was being pretty clear when I asked her to hold off. But of course, that request was ignored, and she came back loaded with clothes. She went all out for my daughter, 5 whole bags of clothes, and grabbed a couple of things for my son as if it were an afterthought. It was painfully obvious she favored my daughter, and my son could tell too. It was his birthday after all, and he was getting sidelined by this sudden shopping spree for his sister. One of the main things my daughter had been looking forward to was wearing a Belle costume in the parks. Belle is her absolute favorite, and she was so excited to dress up like her. But Sasha, for some reason, kept trying to push for an Ariel costume instead. She even suggested that we get one because Ariel was her favorite princess. I had to remind her that we don't watch The Little Mermaid at home because my daughter is terrified of Ursula. You'd think that would be the end of it, but Sasha just couldn't let it go. She kept bringing it up until I had to put my foot down and remind her that Belle was our choice, not hers. And then there were the endless photos. Sasha was absolutely insistent on snapping pictures with my daughter in front of the castle at Magic Kingdom. My son got a few photos too, but it was clear he was an afterthought. She barely gave him any attention, which hurt him. To make matters worse, she tried multiple times to maneuver herself into situations where she could sit next to my daughter on rides or at shows. We went to see the Muppets, and she actually tried to get my daughter to sit in her lap, which was really strange and unnecessary. My daughter wasn't comfortable with it, and honestly, neither was I. The final straw came on the last day of the trip. My husband had a minor injury, so I took him to the first aid station while the kids stayed with my dad and Sasha. The kids had wanted to ride Peter Pan's flight, but the line was too long. Instead of checking for something else they'd enjoy, Sasha decided to take them on the Little Mermaid ride, promising there was nothing scary on it. Well, if you've ever been on that ride, you'll know there's a pretty prominent Ursula animatronic, and my daughter was terrified. By the time I reunited with them, she was sobbing, clinging to her brother for comfort. Once we got back home, I told my dad that we wouldn't be doing any more trips with Sasha. I explained how uncomfortable she'd made all of us, and that her blatant favoritism was not only upsetting to me, but also confusing and hurtful to my son. My dad didn't take it well at all. He actually got angry and said Sasha was just trying to make the trip special for the kids and that we should be grateful. That's when I lost it. I told him, straight up, that her behavior was creepy and inappropriate. I reminded him that it was because of her actions we'd have to reconsider their access to the kids if things didn't change. Since then, it's been a mess. My dad and I haven't spoken much, and Sasha has texted a few apologies, saying she only wanted to spend time with the kids and that it wasn't her intention to upset us. But I feel like I can't trust her. I believe she may have had good intentions, but her actions were so out of line, and the blatant favoritism was something I just can't overlook. Part of me wonders if I might have overreacted, but honestly, every instinct I have is telling me that I did the right thing for my kids. Weeks passed after that Disney trip, but the fallout didn't settle as quickly as I'd hoped. My dad was still upset with me and my husband, and I could feel it every time we talked, which admittedly wasn't often. Meanwhile, Sasha started sending more messages, apologizing again and again. She'd say things like, "I'm sorry if I overstepped," or "I just wanted the kids to have a magical experience," but the reality was, I couldn't shake off what had happened. She would talk about how she just wanted to bond with the kids, but every time it seemed more about what she wanted than what they did. The problem, I realized, was that her idea of bonding completely ignored our boundaries, our preferences, and especially our kids' feelings. And I'll admit, maybe I used some harsh words when I spoke to my dad after the trip. Calling her a creep wasn't my finest moment. But honestly, every fiber of my being just wanted to protect my kids from her overbearing behavior. One night, as my husband and I were talking over everything, I finally realized that what bothered me the most was the favoritism. It wasn't just Sasha's obsessive attention toward my daughter, but how my son had felt pushed aside during his own birthday celebration. Every family outing, every shared experience, it should have been about both of our kids, not just one. And I could see it hurting him, even if he tried to put on a brave face. My son might be young, but he's smart. He could tell that Sasha's attention was almost entirely on his sister, and he didn't like it one bit. Then there was the issue of trust. My dad insisted that Sasha was doing her best to show love, but in my gut, I didn't feel that her behavior was right. She never really listened to us or respected our boundaries. It was like every time we said no or explained something, she heard what she wanted instead. It wasn't that she didn't understand, it's that she didn't seem to care. After a particularly long and exhausting conversation with my dad, I knew I needed to take a step back. I told him plainly that my husband and I wouldn't be allowing our kids on any more trips with Sasha. I didn't go into details beyond what I'd already shared, but I made it clear, if Sasha couldn't respect our boundaries, she wouldn't get the privilege of spending time with our kids, especially not on trips. My dad took it hard, saying that we were being unfair and that we'd blown the situation out of proportion. But I held firm. If there was anything I'd learned from being a parent, it was that my responsibility was to protect my children, even if it meant uncomfortable conversations with my dad. In response, Sasha went quiet for a bit, but a few days later, she started sending more texts. She apologized again, then added, "I just wanted to spend more time with the kids." I didn't respond at first. What was there to say? She wasn't hearing us. My husband was supportive through all of this and encouraged me to keep our boundaries steady. He pointed out that we'd both tried to handle the Disney trip gracefully, but that no amount of Sasha's apologies could change the fact that she'd ignored everything we'd asked of her. I didn't doubt her feelings toward the kids, but I had serious doubts about her ability to respect our parenting choices. For a while, things were quiet. My dad and I had our space, Sasha kept her distance, and the kids, bless them, went about their usual business. I thought maybe things were starting to get back to normal, even if it wasn't a perfect normal. Then came the unexpected news. I found out I was pregnant again. We had always said that 2 kids was our ideal number, but sometimes life has its own plans, and we were thrilled. After processing the news, my husband and I decided to keep it a secret for a little while, to enjoy the quiet joy of this new addition on our own. Eventually, we'd tell the kids, but for now, it was our little family secret. Of course, I knew that once we shared the news, things with my dad and Sasha could become more complicated. I wasn't naive. I knew that Sasha might feel a certain way about us having another child, especially if this one happened to be a girl. Based on everything she'd already shown us, she'd probably zero in on our new daughter just as intensely as she had with my older daughter, possibly even more so. The very thought of it made me anxious, but I knew we'd cross that bridge when we got there. For now, my husband and I agreed that the best thing we could do was focus on our kids and this pregnancy and not let anyone disrupt our peace. This was our life, our family, and we were the ones who would decide how to protect and care for our kids. But I'll admit, the thought of Sasha finding out and reacting in some obsessive way was a heavy weight in the back of my mind. We finally shared the pregnancy news with family a couple of months later, after our excitement made it hard to keep quiet. When we told my dad, he was thrilled, congratulating us and asking if there was anything he could do to help. I gave him the usual, "Thanks, but we're good for now," and felt a weight lift. It was nice to feel his support again after the tension following the Disney trip. He didn't mention Sasha during the call, and I hoped that maybe he'd given her the message to respect our space when it came to the kids. Then a few days later, my dad called again, and I could tell by his tone that something was up. He started off with small talk, but then he slipped in. "So Sasha heard about the pregnancy." I braced myself. He explained that she'd been happy for us, but that she seemed off, even a little withdrawn ever since we shared the news. Later, Sasha texted me herself, offering congratulations. I thanked her and kept things polite, but I could tell that something was bugging her. Her messages were full of careful wording, as if she were tiptoeing around a topic she didn't want to say out loud. I figured I'd leave it alone and focus on keeping our boundaries strong. If I'd learned anything by now, it was that Sasha's excitement around kids often turned suffocating. Then came my sister's birthday in April, which meant we were expected to get together for the first time since everything went down. My dad was eager for us to be there, and my sister too, since she missed the kids. But after discussing it with my husband and hearing our kids' thoughts, we decided to skip the event. The last thing I wanted was for Sasha to hover over my daughter and ignore my son again. Besides, our kids had been clear. They didn't want to be around Sasha if she couldn't respect their wishes. When I broke the news to my dad, he tried to hide his disappointment, but I could tell he was frustrated. We ended up getting into it again, with him insisting that Sasha meant well and that this separation was unfair to him as a grandfather. I had to be honest with him. I told him that, yes, he deserved a relationship with his grandkids, but not at the expense of their comfort or our boundaries as parents. My dad didn't take that well, but we left it at that. In the end, we arranged a private dinner with my sister at her favorite restaurant after her party. She was understanding, though I could tell she missed seeing the kids regularly. She even shared some insights with me, saying she thought Sasha's behavior was too much during the trip but wasn't sure how to address it with my dad. It helped to know I wasn't the only one who saw the problem. Weeks went by, and Sasha's attempts to connect with the kids kept coming in small, subtle ways. She'd call me, claiming to ask about something random, only to follow up with, "Are the kids around? I'd love to say hi." Each time I'd remind her gently but firmly that we were taking a break. This back and forth happened almost a dozen times, enough that I began questioning whether I'd ever be comfortable bringing my kids around her again. And with the baby on the way, I started to feel even more protective of my family's space. One afternoon, my dad called and told me Sasha was interested in planning another family vacation with all the kids. He said she'd been talking nonstop about places we could go and things the kids would love. As he listed off ideas, I felt that familiar sinking feeling. I had to remind him, again, that our kids weren't going on any trips with Sasha until we could trust her to respect our family's boundaries. My dad seemed taken aback, but he dropped the subject after that. The whole experience felt exhausting. On one hand, I wanted to believe that Sasha's intentions were good, and that maybe she was just clumsy with boundaries. But each time she'd push, whether in big ways or small ones, it reminded me that her need to bond with my daughter was coming at the cost of both of my kids' comfort. My son had already made it clear he didn't enjoy being around her, and the last thing I wanted was to force them into situations where they felt uneasy. For my husband and me, the priority was clear. Our family needed peace and security, not more forced interactions. As difficult as it was to keep our distance, especially with my dad feeling hurt by the decision, I knew this was the only way to protect our kids from feeling suffocated. We agreed to continue seeing my dad separately, and he respected that for the most part, though I could sense his frustration each time we declined an event with Sasha involved. Then, unexpectedly, we got some positive news. Our kids had been asking us if we could return to Disney World, just the 4 of us this time. Hearing that was like a breath of fresh air. Despite the mess that had gone down with Sasha, they had loved the trip and wanted to go back, but without the complications. Seeing them happy and excited about it felt like a sign we were doing something right by holding our ground and keeping our family time special and stress-free. That realization gave me even more confidence in the boundaries we'd set, no matter how many times my dad pushed back. Our focus had to be on creating a safe, healthy space for our kids to be themselves without anyone treating them like props. And if that meant keeping Sasha at arm's length, so be it. A few months after that last conversation with my dad, we had another family gathering on the calendar, my daughter's 5th birthday party. I knew that my dad would want to be there, and after talking it over, my husband and I decided we'd invite him, but make it clear that Sasha wasn't welcome this time. My daughter had been uncomfortable around her ever since the Disney trip, and that wasn't something I was going to ignore. When I called my dad to tell him, he accepted the invitation, but was obviously frustrated about Sasha being excluded. I explained again that the kids needed space and that her constant overstepping had created this tension. He eventually agreed to come alone, but I had a nagging feeling he was holding something back. The party came and went without any issues, thankfully. My dad came, behaved himself, and the kids were genuinely happy to see him. I could tell my daughter felt relaxed and safe with just us there, no one hovering or trying to push her into activities she didn't want to do. It was a big relief for my husband and me to see that, proof that the boundaries we'd set were helping our kids feel more comfortable. But shortly after the party, my dad reached out again. He told me about a conversation he'd had with Sasha, which had apparently brought some heavy truths to the surface. He said that ever since I'd announced my pregnancy, Sasha had been struggling with some deep feelings she'd never fully addressed. It turns out that although she married my dad knowing he didn't want more kids, she had always hoped he'd eventually change his mind. When our son was born, she tried to hint at it. But when my dad didn't pick up on those hints, she eventually gave up. In her words, my daughter had become her way of experiencing a bond she'd longed for, but couldn't have herself. Apparently, the Disney trip was meant to fulfill a fantasy of hers, one where she got to play the part of a doting girl mom with all the activities she'd dreamed about. And my daughter, without realizing it, had become the child Sasha had always wanted, but never had. Hearing this was a revelation, but it also made a lot of her behavior make sense. She hadn't been thinking about what my daughter wanted. She was only focused on what she herself wanted, pushing her own fantasy at the expense of my daughter's feelings. While I felt a pang of sympathy for her, I couldn't ignore what this had cost my kids. Sasha had allowed her own desires to override our boundaries and had consistently ignored what was best for my children. And learning that she'd done all of this, fully aware of our wishes, only made me more certain about limiting her involvement in our lives. My dad seemed almost apologetic when he explained this to me, and he even admitted he understood why I was so cautious about Sasha's behavior. After our conversation, I knew there was no going back to the way things were. My husband and I agreed that we'd continue with limited contact. I would see my dad on occasion with the kids, but Sasha would remain on the outside. My daughter's well-being had to come first, and I wasn't going to let Sasha's unresolved issues interfere with that. I'd let her get away with too much already, and I was done. As the months passed, things were quiet, and that was exactly what we needed. I heard from my dad that Sasha had tried to bring up the idea of another family vacation, but he'd put his foot down, telling her it wasn't going to happen. For once, he seemed to understand that boundaries mattered, and I was grateful he respected that. Fast forward to the present, and here we are. I'm now in my 3rd trimester, and the baby will be here soon. The kids are ecstatic, especially my daughter, who can't wait to be a big sister. We've decided to keep the baby's sex a surprise until birth, just as we did with our first 2, and everyone, including Sasha, knows we're not sharing any details until after the baby arrives. To her credit, she hasn't reached out since we last spoke, but knowing what I do now, I don't plan on giving her a prominent role in our baby's life. Reflecting on everything that's happened, I realize this entire experience has taught me a lot about setting boundaries and sticking to them. For the first time, I feel like I truly know where I stand as a parent and what I need to do to protect my kids from anything that makes them uncomfortable. I still love my dad and want him to have a relationship with his grandchildren, but it will be on terms that keep my kids' happiness and safety front and center. For now, life feels good. My children are thriving. They've got a new sibling on the way, and we're planning a family trip back to Disney World sometime next year. This time, without any drama, just our little family. We're excited to make memories that are completely our own, without any outside pressure. And maybe one day Sasha will find peace with her own decisions. But as for my family, I'll keep protecting our space, our happiness, and our boundaries. Story 2. In order to purchase a large home for her family, my stepdaughter attempted to evict me from my own house. I suppose I should begin with the state of affairs before to the start of all this bullshit. About 30 years ago, I met my late wife Laura, who had already given birth to a young child named Sarah. I had no qualms about taking on the role of father to Sarah, who was just 2 at the time. Sarah is still my child, even if Laura and I did not have children together. I adored her as if she were my own, and my entire life seemed to turn upside down when Laura died in that accident. Even though Sarah was just a teenager at the time, I was determined to protect her at all costs. My job as a high school English teacher wasn't very lucrative, but it was reliable, and I like what I did. Being a lone parent following Laura's death meant that I would need all of my patience, as she used to joke that I had it. After Laura passed away, the first few years were difficult, but Sarah and I managed to get through them together. In the kitchen, she would assist me. We would go camping and watch movies. We managed to make it work, albeit it wasn't simple. Sarah was also intelligent. I believed she would succeed. Perhaps pursue a career in law or something like. I thus put her name on the home when she turned 18. At least she would have the house if something were to happen to me, I reasoned. It was simply a normal 3-bedroom house, nothing special or large, but it was filled with memories. I believed that this would reassure her that she would always have a place to call home. At the time, that choice seemed sensible. I never imagined that it would eventually come back to haunt me. As time passed, Sarah ultimately met a man by the name of Tom. He appeared okay at first, charming, sort of. She was ecstatic about him as well. Just seeing her so delighted made me happy. She spoke about him often, describing his ambition and lofty aspirations. However, I saw that her attitude began to shift somewhat as they became more serious. Every conversation seemed to go back to how costly this or that luxury was, and she showed less interest in the activities we used to enjoy together. However, I dismissed it and attributed it to young love. After that, they were married, and I was very delighted for her. Perhaps this was what she needed to find her own happiness and settle down, I thought. Being alone didn't bother me. Even though I had been doing it for years, things just seemed different after the wedding. The phone calls slowed down, and we stopped having our regular Saturday dinners. When she did call, it was generally to discuss a recent costly purchase or a new upscale location they had visited. She seemed to be living in a whole different reality. Approximately a year later, Sarah and Tom asked me to join them for supper. They didn't often ask me around, and their apartment was in one of those new, glossy, affluent districts, so this was something special. I couldn't get rid of the sensation that I didn't belong there, even if it was wonderful. They're out there in this upscale world where looks seem to be everything, and I'm simply a retired school teacher. It was a lovely evening, but we did converse a little. It primarily concerned the purchases they were making or the trips they were organizing. I attempted to bring up little details from our common background, but she would dismiss them as insignificant. After dinner, they began to make hints that they were considering moving to a larger home in order to establish a family. I assumed it was simply light banter, so I nodded along. That supper was the beginning of a lot of difficulties, even though I was unaware of it at the time. Sarah abruptly phoned a few weeks later and began to discuss the entire family duty issue. She went on to add that she and Tom had been considering ways to assist, and at that point she suggested that perhaps it would be best for everyone if I sold the property and downsized. She also said that they had a lot on their plates with this major move they were preparing. Admittedly, I was taken aback. I had never considered selling the house at all. I called this place home. Laura and I had begun our lives together in Sarah, the town where I had grown up. I didn't like the thought of simply giving it up. I thus made it clear to her that I had no interest in moving. After a little pause, she simply sighed and went on to something else. However, there was a sharpness to her voice that bothered me. For me, it would have been the last of it. Sarah, however, refused to let it go. Every time she phoned, she would say something like, "The market is great right now," or "I'd like a smaller place." I would always tell her that I wasn't interested. Although it was becoming annoying, I assumed she would soon stop. However, no. Rather, they arrived without warning one day. It seems like yesterday to me. When I heard the knock, I was on the couch watching one of those old movies Laura and I used to enjoy. They were there, looking serious, as I opened the door. Sarah was doing that thing where she would look you down as if she were trying to convey something without speaking, while Tom held a folder. After they entered and seated me, Tom unlocked the folder and took out some documents. He began to explain that they had been considering their options and that selling my property would be the best course of action for all parties. He continued by saying that the market was improving, that they would assist me in selling, and that it had allowed me to relocate to a more manageable location. Like he was doing me a favor, he stated it. It was difficult for me to maintain my composure. I made it clear to them that I would not be moving. I had no desire to sell. I had raised Sarah in this house for years, and I still felt a connection to Laura. However, Sarah's expression altered the moment I said that. She gave me the impression that she was disappointed, like I was disappointing her in some way. They departed shortly after, saying in hushed tones that I was making things difficult or that they didn't understand. I recall sitting there feeling as like something I couldn't even describe had struck me as soon as the door shut behind them. I just realized that it wasn't over yet. I assumed they would finally abandon the notion of selling the house after their most recent discussion with Sarah and Tom. I had been explicit, or so I believed. However, I was still apprehensive, as if I would hear from them shortly. I was correct. More dramatic and downright cunning was what followed. After a week or so, Sarah began calling me every day. After engaging in light talk for a while, she would quickly return to the same topics, such as my retirement needs and how I would prefer a smaller setting. She would go on about how I needed to consider the future and that downsizing was a necessary part of moving on. My future. She would keep dropping hints as if to wear me down, but I was okay. She then made the decision to include Tom one afternoon. Once more, they knocked on the door without warning, as if it were a routine family visit. I responded, mentally preparing myself for any fresh viewpoint they would introduce. They arrived with the same vigor as before, but Tom was prepared to go all out for sales this time. He had a litany of arguments for why I ought to convince them of the advantages of living with them while I still had the opportunity. They spoke as though they were worried about me, but I could tell from the way they continued that they weren't very interested in my welfare. They all nodded and smiled as though they were taking me in as a huge favor. Then Tom said something else. Maintenance would no longer be a concern for you. Imagine living a life in which you are not required to do any work. It dawned on me then. They were portraying the entire situation as though I were a weak, defenseless individual who depended on them for survival. To make it seem like I needed their assistance, they were attempting to portray me as a burden that needed to be taken care of. Reiterating that I had no interest in selling the house, I stood my position. I called this location home. I have only known this house when Sarah was a young child. The nice act, however, faltered a little when I stated that. Tom sighed, glancing at Sarah as if I were being obstinate. With her arms crossed, Sarah gave me the impression that she was the one who was dissatisfied. With a stern, almost lecturing tone, she remarked, "Dad, you're not being reasonable. You've accomplished a lot on your own, but perhaps it's time to let go and accept our assistance." I informed them I was grateful for the offer, but would not be compromising. They lingered for a few more minutes, and the atmosphere between us felt more tight than ever. I quote, "I'll admit that it stung to watch Sarah treat me like a burden, but I wasn't going to give in because they were irritated with me." After a few more forced grins and courteous goodbyes, they departed, but I still felt horrible about the entire experience. I pondered why Sarah was behaving in this manner as I sat there mentally reliving everything. This was not the child I had reared, the one who had remained with me following the death of her mother, preserving Laura's spirit by sharing memories and experiences. her expression toward me today. She seemed to view me as an elderly guy who was obstructing her path. It didn't seem right, as if I were somehow losing her. The situation worsened a few days later. A real estate representative arrived while I was outside watering the lawn. She approached me directly, beaming, clipboard in hand, and gave her introduction. "Mr. Williams is correct. Sarah invited me to stop by and talk with you about your possibilities for advertising your house. I am aware that you want to sell." My stomach dropped. No real estate agent had been contacted. Hadn't even thought about selling. She simply seemed perplexed when I informed her that I didn't understand what she was talking about. I must have misinterpreted. Sarah gave the impression that this was finalized. She responded, still happy but obviously taken aback by my response. She gave me her card, said something about getting in touch with her if I had second thoughts, and then went back to her car. I gave Sarah a call that evening. It was time for some certain answers, but I didn't want to make any assumptions. She seemed shocked to hear me when she took up the phone. I questioned her directly. "Why are you coming to my house as a real estate agent, discussing listing it?" She paused for a long moment before responding, her voice serene but with an odd edge. "We just want to help you go on with your life, Dad. You don't intend to stay there permanently, do you?" It hurt. After hearing it so plainly stated, I informed her that I was in charge of my destiny and that neither she nor Tom should force their ideas on me. She mumbled something about being tough and let out a long, almost irritated sigh. Then she made a statement that I still remember. "Don't make things more difficult than they need to be, Dad." I realized then that this was more than simply their proposal. They really intended to eject me. I abruptly stopped the conversation because I needed some time to simply take it all in. "However," Sarah continued, "she began bringing up all these safety issues every time we spoke the next week. 'Dad, you're getting older, and that house is a lot for you to handle,' she would add. 'Or isn't it convenient to have someone nearby in case something goes wrong?' She began to portray me as a defenseless elderly guy who lived alone and struggled as though I couldn't take care of myself. To strengthen her argument, she seemed to be attempting to invent an issue where none existed. When Tom believed I wasn't home one morning, I even caught him looking around my garage. When I asked him what he was doing, he pretended to be astonished and said he was simply looking at some items, but he hurried off. After that, everything was becoming weird and eerie. They seemed to be hovering about waiting for me to give in, and I felt alienated in my own house. The worst thing. I became suspicious and began to doubt everything. Every time I saw them, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, wondering if they were planning anything new. It was the first time I had ever felt that way about Sarah. She was meant to be my daughter and a member of my family. But I was starting to doubt everything because of this whole situation. I couldn't help but remember her early years. Recalling the little girl who used to spend hours sitting with me discussing life and goals, and who would run to me when she was having a rough day. However, she was suddenly staring at me as if I were a burden, as if I were only a hindrance. I didn't want to think she was capable of such manipulation. However, the indications were present. This was no longer only a suggestion. I was right in the heart of her and Tom's plot, like a piece on their chessboard. I remained awake that night, gazing at the ceiling, wondering what might happen next. I knew one thing for sure, but I wasn't going to give up. This was not the end of the conflict. I believed that things couldn't get much worse after all of the pressure Sarah and Tom had been placing on me to sell the property. It was fairly obvious that I wasn't selling, and that was it. However, it seems that they missed the message. Or perhaps they simply didn't give a damn, because perhaps they had finally backed off one evening, right when I was beginning to think. Sarah gave me a call. She wasted no time at all. "We really need to talk about your living situation, Dad," she remarked. She has an icy voice. I agreed to meet with them the next day, even though I could immediately feel that this would not be a cordial conversation. I reasoned that if we discussed it in person, perhaps, just possibly, they might finally see my point of view. They were armed when they got there. Of course, in a metaphorical way, Sarah was sporting the type of resolute expression I'd seen her adopt when she was adamant about winning a debate, and Tom was carrying this folder under his arm. Before they even sat down, Tom opened the folder, took out a few documents, and began talking about security, accountability, and financial planning. In my advanced years. Instead of engaging in discussion, it seemed like they were lecturing me. I'd had enough of this after a few minutes. I made it clear to them that I was more than capable of handling things on my own, and that I had no intention of selling the property. At that point, Tom remarked, "Look, we know this is difficult for you to accept, but you're not thinking clearly, Dad," in the most patronizing tone imaginable. Unable to think clearly. I said it again, attempting to contain my emotions. What I was hearing was unbelievable. They were behaving as though I were a weak, elderly guy who was incapable of making decisions for myself. I refused to be destroyed by them, so I reiterated to them that I would not be moving. But rather than retreating, I had never seen Sarah's face contort like that before. "We'll have to do it for you if you can't make a wise choice here," she replied, leaning forward. She seemed really serious, as if she were genuinely threatening me. At that moment, Tom slipped a written offer to sell the house over the table. He clarified that they had already discovered purchasers eager to make a fast sale and had had the property evaluated informally. "We quote, be insane not to sell now," he continued, given the state of the market. I informed him that whatever of the proposals they had prepared, I had no interest in selling. Then the actual blow was dropped by Sarah. "Dad," she murmured in a nearly practiced voice, "it's not only about you. Tom and I have the opportunity to purchase a new house, but the down payment will require a little extra money. You would have a place to live where you wouldn't be alone in exchange for helping us establish our family." Everything made sense at that point. This had nothing to do with downsizing or assisting me. They intended to finance their lives with my house. They no longer even made an effort to conceal it. It was all nonsense to obtain what they wanted. All that crap about my being alone or having trouble with maintenance. They intended to sell my house, take the money for themselves, and then lodge me in a guest room at their house so they could monitor me. "This is my house where I raised you, Sarah," I said, pushing the offer page back toward them, "where your mother and I resided. I refuse to give it up for your schemes. Her voice froze as she snapped. "All right," she responded, crossing her arms, "if that's how you feel. Just keep in mind that you placed me on the deed, thus it's also my home. I am legally entitled to make judgments in this situation." She was embracing the fact that the deed bore her name. I believed it would safeguard her future all those years ago. I never thought she would turn it against me in this way. Sarah continued to speak, but I got up so I wouldn't have to listen to any more of their requests. "Consider it, Dad. At your age, do you really want this type of stress? You would become a part of our life and relieve all of that stress if you moved in with us. With your future grandkids, you may assist. What I was hearing was unbelievable. By presenting the prospect of a family to me as a reward for complying with their wishes, they were now attempting to guilt-trip me. However, I had finished their game. "I'm not selling," I informed them, "that they may go if they couldn't accept that my choice was final." Tom got up and gave me this phony, compassionate expression after realizing they were not making any progress. "Okay, well, give it some thought." I knew this wasn't the end for them, but he tried to seem reasonable. I could tell from the way they looked at me that they would return, most likely under considerably greater strain. For a short time after they went, the home seemed like mine once more. However, I couldn't get rid of the persistent thought that this was only the start of something more serious. Before she was resolute, I had noticed that expression in Sarah's eyes. When she wanted anything as a teenager, she'd gotten this way, and she generally managed to get it. They began phoning more frequently over the course of the following few days, texting me about how unfair it was that I was hoarding resources when they needed a place to live with their family. Sarah even went so far as to claim that my failure to support her and Tom's future was selfish. Selfish. I had dedicated my entire life to provide her with a nice existence, putting her first. And now, because I wasn't prepared to give my house away as a reward, it was me who was self-centered. When I went to pick up the mail one day, I noticed an envelope from an unfamiliar law firm. When I opened it, I saw a letter from Sarah's attorney. Along with a ton of other jargon I didn't really grasp, it was packed with legalese and cautions on how co-owners must think about selling their joint property. It was obvious that they intended to try to take my hand away. When I phoned a friend of mine who used to work in real estate, he informed me that they could be investigating a partition action, which allows one co-owner to compel the sale of a property if the other owner declines. In essence, it implied that they may force me to sell my house by going to court. I sat in my living room that evening and simply gazed at all the memories in that house. The pictures displayed on the wall. Laura's old armchair where she used to sit. The books on the shelf were ones I had read to Sarah as a child. I felt as though my own daughter was throwing away everything I had worked so hard to build over the years, including love and effort. Now it was obvious that neither Tom nor Sarah were going to quit. I knew one thing, but I had no idea what they would attempt next. I had no intention of allowing them to intimidate me out of my own house. I was still attempting to make sense of everything the day after receiving the legal letter. It was similar to an unwakeable nightmare. The stepdaughter I have, the child I brought up as if she were my own, was pursuing me and threatening to sue me. I had provided her with a house and all else I could. She wants to pull it out from under me immediately. The more I refused, the more it seemed. She grew increasingly adamant about getting what she wanted. A buddy who had heard tales called me that morning. Sarah had apparently been telling others around town that I was having trouble handling things by myself, presenting myself as a weak, defenseless elderly guy. She was telling people that she and Tom were only attempting to look out for me because I was no longer able to take care of the house. It seemed unbelievable to me. She was attempting to make me appear inept in addition to pressuring me to sell. They had gone into full manipulation mode at that point, using every tactic known to man to make me appear incapable of handling myself. However, I wasn't going to allow them to turn me into a victim in my own life. I therefore began to maintain records. Every phone conversation, every message, and every time Sarah gave me a tip about how I should really approach marketing, I put it in writing. If they intended to use legal ploys, I intended to be prepared. Sarah and Tom returned to my door a few days later. They didn't bother with the phony politeness this time. Without even saying hello, they arrived and went right to the point. Tom was not far behind Sarah, who had this cold expression in her eyes, behaving as though he understood everything. He was even carrying another set of paperwork. I thought it was more legal bullshit. "Dad, we're here to talk about the house sale." Like she was reading from a script, Sarah's voice sounded emotionless and lifeless. "It quotes a good deal that we have prepared. We don't want this to go on any longer than absolutely necessary." I simply gazed at them. A part of me felt angry, and another half wanted to laugh. They were handling the entire situation as though it were a commercial transaction, not the house I had built all my life. Despite my best efforts to remain composed, I couldn't help it. "Sarah, this isn't happening. No matter how many offers you receive, I won't care. I'm not trying to sell." Tom interrupted at that point, wearing a smug expression. "Actually, you have no option. We have every right to sell our portion, and you are only a co-owner." He leaned in as though he was trying to make a really good point. "By allowing you to remain here after we pass away, we are being kind. If we weren't so understanding, you may be out on the streets." I could feel the heat rising in my body. I was not being spoken to by an outsider. I had welcomed Tom into my family, and here he was. He was essentially threatening to evict me from my own house after I treated him with the utmost respect. I reiterated that I had no interest in them and that they need to go. Tom, however, only grinned. "Eventually, you'll have to relocate, in one way or another." As if he liked seeing me wriggle, he murmured, "Why not simplify this for yourself?" I became aware that I was facing the prospect of a court case at that same time. They weren't only attempting to exert pressure on me. If they had to, they were going to make me sell. It was a harsh truth. They had no regard for me, my life here, or the significance of this place to me. They just noticed a dollar symbol. I sat by myself in the living room after they departed, contemplating everything. I have spent years creating this area. The memories of parenting Sarah with Laura. And now everything was being boiled down to a financial dispute. The house was no longer the only concern. It has to do with honor, about defending myself. I refused to give in to their intimidation and leave my own house. I told my lawyer pal Dean everything over the phone. After I finished, he added, "We have a fight on our hands, but don't worry." He listened patiently. "We will ensure that they do not trample you." I felt a sense of comfort when he said that. Dean was more than simply my attorney. He was acquainted with me, who knew what I had endured in order to create my life. He refused to be pushed around by them. Dean filed a motion the next day to stop the house from being sold without my permission. At that point, the situation really heated up. Tom and Sarah learned rather quickly, and they were not pleased, as you may imagine. Sarah called me and seemed almost desperate, as if she was shocked that I was actually confronting them. "Why are you doing this, Dad?" she made a demand. "All we're trying to do is assist you, but you're making things more difficult. Assist me," I answered, my voice unable to contain the cynicism. "How might attempting to evict me from my house benefit me?" "Sarah?" She fell silent. She probably didn't anticipate that I would respond with her own words. She subsequently began to indulge in guilt trips. She said that in order to begin their lives together, Tom and she needed the money. That by keeping a place I didn't really need, I was being self-centered. She gave the impression that I was a rapacious old guy holding on to his belongings. I told her I'd heard enough and hung up rather than a parent attempting to defend his house. I refused to allow her to turn this around. I wasn't going to fall for it since I knew what they were doing. They continued to phone throughout the course of the following few days, attempting various strategies each time. They would occasionally act hurt. They may be blatantly unpleasant at times. They seemed unable to choose between using threats to threaten me or using friendliness to influence me. A for sale sign was then nailed into my front yard one day. I was enraged. I rushed outside, tore it out, and tossed it in the garbage. However, it didn't stop there. Acting as though they had every right to show people around my residence, Sarah and Tom began to visit with realtors. As though I hadn't been there, they led prospective purchasers around the property, as if I were invisible. I once stood in the hallway and watched a family go around the rooms, taking in the living room, the garden, and the layout. It seemed unreal, as though I was witnessing outsiders dissect every aspect of my existence. It was intolerable to me. Since this was my house and I wasn't selling, I instructed them all to go. Sarah, however, simply rolled her eyes and informed me that I was being irrational. In contrast, Tom treated me as though I were a barrier that he just had to remove. I felt exhausted when they departed, like if they had stolen a piece of me with them. I came to see that this was more than simply a quarrel. Whatever it took, they were determined to take this mansion. However, I wasn't going down just yet. I'd brought Sarah up and given her everything, so if she felt she could just come in here and grab what was rightfully mine, then so be it. She was about to experience something else. I called this place home, and I was willing to go to any lengths to maintain it. Last patch. After all the efforts Sarah and Tom had made to evict me from my house, it came to this point where we were in court together. They had tried every possible tactic to undermine me. Putting a sign that says "for sale" in my yard, letting outsiders tour my home, claiming I was too elderly and unable to handle my own affairs. I paraded around town. They believed they had trapped me, but I wasn't going to surrender easily. They entered the courtroom as though they had already won. Sarah refused to meet my gaze, and Tom was wearing his arrogant smile. Their expensive, too professional lawyer was prepared to claim that they were just working in my best interests and assisting a suffering family member in moving to a more acceptable living situation. They had misrepresented how much I had prepared, but it was twisted the way they had twisted everything to make it seem like they were helping me. My attorney, Dean, had worked with me for many hours to collect all the messages, calls, logs, and pieces of proof I could offer. I had compiled a comprehensive record of their harassment with his assistance. Sarah's texts accusing me of selfishness. I had seen the real estate listings online without my permission. The testimonials from neighbors who had witnessed their attempts to portray me as a weak, elderly man, unable of taking care of himself, as well as the pictures I had taken of them showing outsiders about my house. Dean explained everything when it was my turn to present. He started by demonstrating how Sarah and Tom's concern for my welfare was just a front for their own avarice. Some of Sarah's letters, especially the ones in which she openly guilt-tripped me for assisting them in starting a family and forgiving the past, were read aloud by him. At first, not much was visible on the judge's face, but I could tell he was listening carefully. Dean continued by discussing their unapproved open homes. He displayed pictures of people they had brought into my house without my consent. People who, like people wandering through an empty showroom, had been in the rooms where I had lived for decades. This wasn't simply impolite, Dean contended. My privacy was flagrantly violated. Sarah glanced down, obviously embarrassed, and the judge's brow wrinkled at that moment. However, Tom continued to look at his lawyer as though he believed he would somehow get out of this situation. However, Dean's reference to the legal notice they had filed marked the true turning point. In order to compel the sale of the house, he noted that Sarah and Tom had even gone so far as to file for a partition action, basically denying me my co-ownership rights without even making an effort to reach an agreement. Dean emphasized that, contrary to what they said, this move was not about my welfare or assisting me in downsizing for my personal benefit. No. Regardless of my desires, this was a planned attempt to sell the property so they could profit from it. As the session progressed, I saw a shift in the judge's countenance as he carefully reviewed the material. The truth of their goals was exposed for everyone to see, and it seemed as though he could finally see through their flimsy justifications. It became evident at the end that they had crossed boundaries. It wasn't only that they were worried about me. They were brutal in their manipulation of the circumstance for their own benefit. The judge clearly indicated in his decision that, as the principal resident and co-owner, I had been violated by Sarah and Tom's acts. He said that their illegal activities demonstrated a lack of respect for my privacy and autonomy, and that their approaches were forceful and lacked sincere concern for my well. He made a strong decision in my favor, maintaining my freedom to stay in my house without their intervention. Furthermore, he mandated that they pay my legal bills, pointing out that their harassment had been harsh and deliberate. I saw the astonishment on their faces when that decision was pronounced. Tom's arrogant smile disappeared when Sarah appeared to have been smacked. He appeared enraged, his cheeks flushed as he realized his grand scheme had just fallen apart. To save face, their lawyer hurried, but it was too late. They had lost, according to the judge's final ruling. After then, their situation deteriorated. Quick. Tom's true colors quickly became apparent. He had been counting on my property to pay him a large sum. Most likely daydreaming of a brand new house in a posh area. But that dream was dead, and Tom was furious because the court had decided against them. Mutual friends informed me that he was not at all managing it. He was upset, claiming that Sarah should have figured out a way to make it work, and blaming her for the entire situation. I learned that Tom had filed for divorce a few weeks later. Sarah was left alone without the prospect of a sizable payoff once he packed up and departed. There was no reason for him to stay. It seems that he decided to end things since he could no longer access my house and the money he had been relying on. Before her eyes, Sarah's ideal existence had fallen apart. It was all because she and Tom had attempted to take something that wasn't theirs. Then, one evening, shortly after learning of their breakup, I had a knock on my door. When I opened it, Sarah was standing there, a ghost of the person I had brought up. Her shoulders were stooped as if she had just lost everything. Her face was pale and her eyes were red from sobbing. She could hardly keep her eyes on me as she gazed up. "I made a mistake, Dad," she muttered. "I had no idea what I was contemplating. Tom, I lost everything. Everything. The home. All I wanted was to get home." For a moment, I was at a loss for words. I used to spend the entire night with this same female, the same daughter I had spent all those years trying to protect and raise. Nevertheless, she attempted to evict me from my own house. She saw me as though I were only a barrier to her ideal existence, and now she was at my door, pleading for another opportunity. I inhaled deeply, experiencing a mixture of resolution and grief. "You brought everything on yourself, Sarah, and I'm sorry for what you're going through. All you wanted to do was take what I had given you, a family and a home. You didn't consider the expense to me at all." She broke down in tears. She reached out as if to give me a hug. However, I stepped back. "Sarah, I believe it's time for you to go your own path. Your decisions were your own. Living with them is now necessary." She stood there, her face crumpling as reality set in, and I watched as I firmly but gently closed the door. I knew that was the correct choice, even if it wasn't simple. She needed to realize that decisions have repercussions, and that trust is not something that can be arbitrarily thrown away whenever it suits you. I experienced an odd sensation of calm as I turned back into my house. I still had my dignity, my home, and my memories. I knew I had made the correct choice, even though I will always have some sort of affection for Sarah. I wasn't going to let anyone, no matter who they were, to take away my house. Story 3. I confided in my partner about my mental health issues. She told me this after placing me on psychiatric hold. So no, I'm not exactly in the best position at the moment. In the age of 29, I work in a job that should provide me with a sense of purpose and help me pay my bills. Let's be honest though, it hardly does either. I'm working so hard. For what purpose? To make ends meet. I'm very certain that many readers understand what I'm saying. You seem to be working tirelessly in the hopes that things would become simpler. However, they don't. And that's simply life for some folks, isn't it? However, things have changed for me recently. Much darker. I have no idea when this entire mental chaos began. I would want to tell that I was a really happy guy who woke up to a horrible day and that everything went south. It's not that easy though. It feels more like a sluggish creep into this strange, shadowy abyss. One day, for example, you discover that the ideas you're thinking aren't typical of a male. You know, what's the point? They ask. And the fact that I don't genuinely want to harm myself makes it scarier. Even when I don't want to, my thoughts continue to wander there, even if I'm not actively planning anything. It seems as though it will ambush me while I'm not looking. Suicidal ideation is the term used to describe these ideas, which essentially mean that they spontaneously appear. Since some of you may not have been there and it may seem too dramatic, I will attempt to create a picture for you even though I have no intentions to do anything at all. I feel like I have this burden on my mind all the time. On certain days, I would get up, go to work, and simply go through the motions. However, it's like a switch being flicked within. It's all numb, as if I'm simply navigating the day automatically. The fact that no one can see it makes it strange. I'm just the same man showing up and doing my work, to everyone else. On the inside, though, everything seems heavy and dark. And I can't get rid of it no matter what I do. To be honest, I believed I could simply keep going. After all, I've handled stress before, right? However, this is not the same. Usually, I just focus on my work, stay busy, attempt to ignore the negative things, and hope they go away. But no matter how hard I tried or how much I tried to divert my attention, these ideas kept coming back. Maintaining a cover on a pot that is already boiling over is like that. It will ultimately pour, even if you can keep it contained for a time. At the darkest moments, I would also have these ideas. It's like if I'm standing at work meant to be paying attention, and all of a sudden my thoughts are wandering about how simple it would be to simply vanish. What the heck is wrong with me? I would thought as I snapped out of it. However, it did occur once more, and once more. It begins to play with your mind. When I go home, I would just sit there and try to understand why I can't get over it, why I can't simply be happy or at least normal. I'm losing this never-ending mental war. It may sound dramatic, but if you've been there before, you understand. And if you haven't, believe me when I say that I wouldn't want anyone to experience that. It feels as though you are imprisoned in an unseen cage. You can't escape every day, no matter what you do. It's basically a battle to keep moving on and to act as though nothing is wrong. You know deep down that it's not. And the most terrifying aspect, I kept it a secret, not a soul. Who wants to hear that after all? That wants to be the one that people believe is broken when they look at you. In the hopes that it would simply go away, I held it all in. Then the darkest days arrived. These are the ones that I remember the most. After a long day, I would return home fatigued and simply sit there thinking nothing, staring at the wall, simply gazing. People would try to contact me on my phone, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. I felt as like I was depleting all of my energy simply to get through the day, leaving nothing for other people. This voice in the back of my mind would murmur that it would be simpler to just give up as I sat in quiet, sometimes for hours at a time. The notion was there all the while, like some shadow I couldn't get rid of, but I never really did it. I began to think that perhaps I couldn't do this alone after a few months of this. That was a difficult pill to swallow, I must say. I've always been the self-sufficient person who handles everything on his own. However, this was unique. I couldn't ignore it or just brush it off. I thus made the decision to open out to my partner after much internal debate. We quote, "We've been dating for 4 years, and she's always supported me. She would be the one to understand, wouldn't she?" We're sitting on the couch one evening, watching a pointless television program, and I made the decision to pursue it. I explained to her that I had been experiencing difficulties lately, that I felt down, and that I had been thinking these things. That was one of the most difficult things I have ever done, I must say. I was hardly able to speak. I was so incredibly concerned about her reaction. However, I couldn't trust anybody else with this. She simply sat there listening, and I reasoned that perhaps this would be beneficial. I continued to clarify, attempting to convince her that I had no plans. That all I needed was someone to listen to me. She then gave a nod, claimed to have comprehended. In fact, I felt quite relieved, as if I had finally figured out how to get out of this rut. Perhaps this will be all right, I thought. I might be all right. In hindsight, perhaps I shouldn't have had such high expectations. She's only 22 years old, so she probably didn't know how to handle this kind of situation. However, I honestly believed that informing her was the proper thing to do at that moment. And for the first time in a long time, I felt as though I might not be so alone in this. I believed that the first step to recovery was opening up, and that I had at last figured out how to deal with these ideas and go on. However, as I had discovered, it was not that easy. I continued where I had left off, eventually confiding in my partner. To be honest, after telling her everything, I experienced a strange sensation of relief. Perhaps this was the first step in rescuing myself from that state of mind. However, I was completely unprepared for what came next. I think I was feeling lighter after our conversation. I thought I would go get some food and take a short break. I assured her that I would return immediately. The trek down the street was brief, something to divert my attention. I believed that everything between us was good, as if we had breached a wall or something. I didn't think she would take any severe action. However, by the time I returned, everything had changed in a way I could never have predicted. I saw 2 police cars parked outside my house as soon as I pulled into my driveway, and I'm completely bewildered as I sit there in my car and stare at these flashing lights. My initial assumption was that there could have been an emergency in the area. However, as soon as I stepped out of the car, one of the cops came up to me and seemed to recognize me right away. "What's my name?" I'm simply nodding when he asks. None of it is being processed yet. My heart is pounding, and I'm trying to think of every scenario that may have gone wrong. "We received a call from someone who is worried about your safety," he continues. Correct. Then it made sense. I understood this had nothing to do with the outer world. It has to do with me. My girlfriend had reported me to the police, and all of a sudden, the sense of relaxation I had experienced moments before was gone. I felt as though I had allowed her into my thoughts. She had betrayed my confidence by using it against me. I made an effort to clarify to the cops that there had been a mistake. I explained to them that I was simply going through a difficult period and had no intention of harming myself. And in the hopes that it might help, I discussed it with her. However, none of it was being heard by them. They insisted repeatedly that it was for my benefit and that they were there to assist. I was angry at this point. What could I do, though? It wasn't really up for debate when they informed me that I would be sent to the hospital for a mental examination. I made an effort to protest, but it was pointless. "Look, we're just here to make sure you're safe," one of them stated. Secure? After enjoying some food in my car, I was now expected to constitute a threat to myself. It was illogical. However, none of that mattered to them. They simply did what they were told. Then I realize, who else did she inform if the police are here? My phone buzzes just in time. My mother is frantically texting me, asking me why I'm in such a horrible place, what's going on, and other things. As it happens, my girlfriend had also phoned my parents. She probably assumed they would agree with her choice to call the police. Perhaps I needed to think this way, or whatever. However, all I experienced was a surge of rage and irritation. My fiancé, my family, and the individuals who were meant to support me had all somehow become, I don't even know what. But certainly not the help I believed I required. So there I am, being led to the hospital by the police. Despite the fact that I did nothing wrong, I'm sitting in the back of a police cruiser like some criminal. I'm furious. I'm more upset with my girlfriend for placing me in this situation than I am with myself for believing that I could trust anyone given what I was going through. When we get at the hospital, they lead me to a separate room where the nurse is waiting. I sat there thinking, this isn't real, as she begins to ask me a lot of questions about my mental health, how I'm feeling, and other things. It feels like a twisted joke, the whole thing. I informed the nurse up front that this was all a mistake that had been exaggerated and that I had no intention of injuring myself. Well, we'll need to do a full evaluation to make sure the whole time, she adds, nodding. All I could think of was how things simply got out of hand. In the hopes that it might help, I had opened up to my partner. And here I was, being treated as though I were a threat to myself, in a chilly clinical room. They stole everything, including my wallet and phone. The fact that I was honest for once made me feel as though I had somehow lost control of my own life. After all, isn't that what everyone advises? If you're having trouble, talk to someone. But see where I ended up? The waiting game, of course, began. For hours, I sat in this little, uncomfortable room doing nothing but reliving every single detail of that discussion with my girlfriend in my mind. I kept asking myself whether there was anything I could have said that would have prevented this series of events, but it simply didn't add together, regardless of how I attempted to interpret it. I believed I had made it apparent to her that I was not actively planning anything. Why contact the police then? Why would I call my parents? At some point, why blow everything up? The entire assessment procedure began when a doctor arrived. He questioned me about my thoughts, how long I had been feeling this way, and other things while remaining composed. I gave the best response I could, but explaining anything is difficult. You hardly comprehend yourself. Everything was clear that he didn't fully understand everything, since I could see him taking notes and occasionally glancing up. I felt much worse when he continued to ask me questions in this cold, professional manner, as if I were just another case. He was attempting to cross something off his list. By the time the initial assessment was eventually completed, I was psychologically and physically exhausted. I simply accepted that no one was going to truly understand me since I didn't have the energy to constantly expressing myself. They had no desire to assist. They were only carrying out their assigned tasks, protocol, methods, checklists. To them, I was simply another number. I won't tell lies. I felt totally deceived sitting in that room with nothing to do but look at the walls. I couldn't stop thinking about my family, my fiancé, and the individuals who should have cared. I had faith in them, became more open than I had ever been. All I needed was someone to truly listen to me, yet here I was, isolated in a sterile room, being treated like a threat to myself. Recognize. Rather, I was given a label and placed in a category. I'm now trapped in this predicament because of them. I wasn't even shocked when they informed me that I would need to remain for more observation. Everything seemed to have taken on a life of its own. Furthermore, I was unable to stop it. Feeling disheartened, I sat there wondering if I would ever be able to view these individuals in my life in the same light. The experience of being admitted to a mental health facility, particularly when it's against your choice, is beyond words. I became aware of how little power I still had the moment they stole my wallet and phone. Hospitals are intended to help you. Isn't that what you think they are? Well, that didn't feel helpful here. Prison was how it felt. It was dark and chilly, as if the whole structure was intended to suck up your remaining hope, and they acted as though you were already irreparably damaged. They finally took me to this small room, which appeared to have not been renovated since the 1980s, after what seemed like hours of waiting. It had a chair, a small table, and a single bed with a thin mattress. The walls had a faded beige tone that was flaking in places, and they smelled like bleach mixed with something rancid. I sat on the bed and looked at the walls, trying to figure out how I got here. The employees, they only spoke to you when it was absolutely necessary. They didn't seem to perceive you as a human being. They were just handling another case. One of the nurses shrugged when I tried to inquire how long I would need to remain here. Muttered something about assessments and turned to go. No actual answers, no explanations. Just blank, icy glances and people walking around as if you don't exist. The worst part followed. My roommate. Not him, I'm not sure what I was expecting, The man was certain that he was a prophet, God or something. He was always muttering to himself and even yelling at the walls. He smashed his head against the wall the first night I was there, leaving red stains behind when I woke up. The personnel dismissed my inquiry for his well-being as if it were a trivial matter. Sometimes he does it, totally unaffected, one of them said. That's how the entire experience was. There was no solitude, no tranquility, and nothing that gave you a sense of humanity. Sleep was impossible since the light was on all the time, and someone came to check on you every half hour. I would lie there, fatigued but unable to fall asleep, as I listened to the hum of fluorescent lights, the shuffle of other patients down the hall, and the creaking of doors. Every sound, every shadow. It seemed as though the location was intended to make you tense. Meals were even more terrible. They claimed that the insipid gray mash that served as breakfast, lunch, and supper was balanced. At first, I made an effort to eat, but I was hardly able. About a day later, I simply gave up. What was the purpose? I had the impression that I had done something wrong and was being punished, despite the fact that I had only opened out to someone I believed I could trust. Then came the medications. Man, oh man, the medications! Despite my repeated assurances that I posed no threat to myself, the physicians had determined that I required medication to help me relax. It didn't matter though. I was only another item on their list and they had their system. They gave me these medications, but they didn't even explain what they were. You either take these or we'll have to use other measures, they said, staring at me when I refused to take them. In essence, if I didn't comply, they would force feed me the food. Yes, I did take them, and whatever they gave me, let me tell you, it was cruel. After 30 minutes, I felt as though cotton had been wrapped around my brain. It was all sluggish and hazy. I was unable to think clearly, not even able to form a whole phrase. I felt as though I was floating outside of myself, seeing this entire horror play out while being helpless to stop it. They would refer to it as treatment, but it felt to me like they were taking away what little power I still had. I was there for 3 days. I did nothing but sit in that dark chamber and look at the walls for 3 long, awful days. I didn't want to chat, despite the staff's best efforts. I could tell they weren't paying attention, not at all. They didn't care that I had previously given them the truth. They just had to cope with me as another body. I remained silent, clammed up, and simply waited for it to end. My parents and girlfriend paid us a visit on the 2nd day. I didn't want to see them, but I could see them through my room's little window, conversing with one of the nurses, who was presumably trying to get a glimpse of me. I had had enough of them. They were the ones that brought me here and determined that I needed this. Without even requesting my opinion, I just shook my head and expressed my disinterest when the nurse informed me that I had guests. I didn't care that I could see the nurse's face fall, as if she thought I was being ungrateful or something. I was furious with them all for assuming they knew what was best for me. I'm upset because I trusted them enough to be vulnerable, only to get the worst conceivable backlash. They didn't comprehend, and I wasn't sure I wanted them to at that moment. In that location, time seemed odd. Everything seemed to slow down and blend together. Days seemed to drag on for hours, and I felt more and more confined each moment I spent there. It was like to being trapped in a twisted form of purgatory with no way out. Knowing that they would ultimately have to let me go was the only thing that kept me going. There was nothing wrong with me. They had no evidence to keep me there, and I posed no threat to myself. I was so exhausted at the end, both physically and psychologically, that I hardly remember myself. I felt as though all of my inner strength had been sapped away. I was informed I would be discharged shortly after the doctors ultimately determined they didn't have enough to keep me any longer. Even so, though, they pretended to be helping me in some way, as if I should be appreciative that they were letting me leave. I simply wanted to get out, was all I could think. I wanted to leave that location and those individuals behind. They had made an already difficult period in my life even worse, to put it as far away from the entire experience as possible. All because I made a mistake in my trust, and I decided on one thing as they led me out of that room and down those desolate halls for the final time. I had finished them all. I was not as relieved as I had anticipated when they eventually let me go. I felt as though whatever part of me that ought to have been thankful for my freedom had been left behind in that mental hospital. They gave me my phone, money, and belongings, as if I were a child who had just received a punishment and was now free to return to the outdoors. But I wanted to go out as soon as I grabbed my belongings. I didn't even turn around or speak to any of the employees. I had had enough of them and that location. Naturally, they were outside waiting for me, my girlfriend and my parents. Each of them had a look that suggested both relief and concern, and it was already visible to me. "Are you all right?" they asked. "Did it also help?" Their faces were filled with emotions. I wasn't going to play into that, though. I had endured enough already. There was nothing that I owed them. As soon as they noticed me, they all began chatting at once. My mother wanted to know how I was doing, while my girlfriend was talking up how much she had missed me and how happy she was that I was safe. My dad attempted to give me one of those strange side hugs. Right now, to be honest, I simply couldn't handle it. I had a surge of rage within me. I just saw them make that decision for me, deciding without even listening what was best. They had tossed me in as if I were a project that needed to be fixed. They now wanted me to act as though nothing was wrong. I remained silent with them, not one. I simply pushed them aside and turned to go. I didn't stop when they called my name and inquired about my whereabouts. I was too busy thinking about other things to give a damn at that moment. I hardly noticed that it had begun to rain as I continued to walk. That felt perfect somehow, as if the entire environment was in sync with my mood. Heavy, gray, chilly. The rain pouring through my garments didn't even bother me. Getting wet seemed to be the least of my troubles after everything. Before I returned to my apartment, I must have traveled a good 3 kilometers. I hadn't even considered calling a cab or finding a transportation, let alone stopping once. I simply continued to walk, allowing the hurt and rage to propel me ahead till I returned. I was tired and soaked by the time I got to my door, but for some reason, the walk seemed to help me decompress. Or perhaps I buried everything so deeply that I was unable to feel anything at all. I didn't care either way. All that mattered was that I was at home. My girlfriend was following me as I entered. She had followed me back, but I hadn't even realized it. However, she was drenched and staring at me as if I were a wounded animal. "We must speak," she said. However, I had finished speaking. When I first opened myself to her, I had already said all that was important. And see where I ended up? I didn't want to listen to her defenses or explanations. None of it was anything I wanted to hear. "We're done," I murmured, staring her in the eye. In that very moment, no justification. Don't attempt to lessen the blow. I didn't have the energy to play nice since I was worn out and depleted. She broke down in tears and said she had simply wanted to assist me and had done what she believed was right. Her solution, however, had been to put me in a mental health facility without even asking what I wanted. How might that be helpful? With someone who could make decisions for me like that without even having a meaningful conversation? How was I expected to feel safe? I gave her till the end of the week to gather her belongings and leave my place. I didn't care at the time, but it seemed cruel. She continued to talk about how much she cared for me and to attempt to explain. I had heard enough, though. I had faith in her. I assumed she would be sympathetic to my plight. Instead, she completely upended my life. Some could argue that I was being too harsh on her, but they would understand if they had experienced what I had. You can't just put someone in that situation and hope that things would return to normal. I sat in my empty apartment and stared at the walls when she eventually departed. It was very, very silent, and I let myself to feel the weight of everything for the first time. The treachery, all the hatred, all of it came at me at once. Although I felt alone, it was somewhat preferable than acting as though I was surrounded by people who didn't genuinely care about my desires. None of them had genuinely asked me what I needed, even though they had all seemed to be helpful. That decision had just been made for me. I wasn't even there. My folks' texts began to ping across my phone. Most likely concerned that I would break up with my partner in that way. I didn't even glance at them, though. I was finished. I had forgotten what it was to genuinely look out for myself since I had spent so much time trying to please other people and play nice. And now, following all of that, Their explanations and guilt trips were too much for me to handle. My parents persisted in phoning me throughout the course of the following several days, sending me lengthy guilt-ridden emails telling me that my girlfriend was only attempting to assist and that I should forgive her. Give her another opportunity. They failed to grasp it. They would never know what it was like to be imprisoned there and treated as though I were flawed simply because I was having difficulties. I felt as though they had removed the only thing I had left, even though I knew they believed they were doing morally. My freedom to choose what I wanted for myself and discard it. My girlfriend had packed up and departed at the end of the week. I didn't bid them farewell, didn't give her a glance as she left the room. I had moved on from that. I had made my decision, and she had made hers. I felt as though a piece of me had perished in that mental health unit, the portion that thought others might comprehend me without passing judgment or attempting to manipulate me. People who believed they understood better than I did what was best for me were unnecessary. I had no idea how liberating it would be to finally create that boundary and let those who had wronged me know that they no longer had the power to determine my life. I was alone, yes, but at least I was alone how I wanted to be. As odd as it may sound, that brought me a sense of calm that I hadn't had in a while. I'm finally sitting here alone now. And I can't get this question out of my head. Was the asterisk me? An asterisk? Cole? I mean, I know that everything is messed up. I recognize that they believed they were assisting me, my parents and my girlfriend. They cared, which is why they did what they did. All right, I understand. However, it still seems like they all utterly destroyed me, and all I needed and desired, and now all I have left is this enormous mess, and everyone tells me I'm mistaken. They must have believed they knew best. In particular, my girlfriend. I shared some really private information with her, things I hadn't even truly told myself. That gave her the go-ahead to call the police on me. Who, after all, does that? She was aware that I had no immediate plans. Instead of paying attention to what I needed, I informed her quite plainly that I was having difficulties, but that I was not in any real danger. She simply lost it and included my family as well, assuming that would be beneficial in some way. And my folks, well, they pretended to be astonished. They seemed unable to comprehend that I was experiencing this. However, I'm not sure. I got the feeling that they ought to have recognized the warning indications. They are aware of how difficult work has been and how my bills have been piling up. How difficult every day has been recently. That aspect of my life isn't anything I'm concealing. I mean, I barely make ends meet. They were aware of that. They were aware of how hard my work has been. And they all behaved as like I were a problem that needed to be fixed, rather than simply someone who needed some understanding when I eventually reached out because it was getting too heavy. I quote now disconnected everyone. I've banned my parents' numbers and my partner is no longer with me. I made it plain that I would report them to the police for trespassing if they persisted. Yes, I am aware that sounds severe. I know that I probably sound like a crazy man to other people. But you would understand if you had experienced what I had. Things change when the people you trust the most determine that locking you away is the best way to assist. It alters your perception of both them and yourself. Then there's the financial aspect of it. Because my brief visit to the psychiatric hospital was obviously not covered by insurance. Now, on top of everything else, I have to pay $10,000 for something I didn't need, didn't ask for, and never wanted. My blood boils every time I consider it, as if I were already drowning in debt and fighting to make ends meet. And since my girlfriend believed she was saving me, I now have a huge debt hanging over my head. I would weep if I didn't laugh. To be honest, I keep hearing that I should contact the hospital and request a lower bill. I understand. Although it's sound advice, I am terrified at the thought of ever having to deal with them again. I'd rather not speak to anyone there. I don't want to go through that again. That location seems to have left a scar, and the bill just reopens whenever I consider taking action. It may sound absurd, yet it is the reality. I would rather leave the account unpaid right now than having to defend myself in front of a billing department. In any case, it probably doesn't care. Then there is the matter of what follows. Because there is really no support system left for me as I sit here. It's okay that I'm alone. It's preferable to being surrounded by individuals who don't truly understand it. However, there is a persistent notion in the back of my mind, accompanied by a small, obnoxious voice that asks, what if they were right? Could it be that you were exaggerating? And that thinking makes me question everything, which is why I detest it. Even after I've pushed them all away, it seems like they still hold on to me. Like I can't completely get away from their kind of assistance, no matter what I do. I was looking around Reddit a few days ago in an attempt to divert my attention when I saw a post from someone who had experienced a similar situation. They discussed how no one truly understood what they needed and how they felt deceived by those closest to them. It was like staring into a mirror, I promise. I wanted to tell them I understood by reaching through the screen dot that I was fully aware of their emotions. I started to question whether I'm as alone as I believe. Perhaps there are other individuals out there who have experienced the same things, who have had their faith in those they believed to be caring broken. But that's all done online in the end. I don't know any of those folks, and they don't know me. Furthermore, knowing that others understand is helpful, but it doesn't actually address the problem. I remain here, still by myself. I'm still bearing this burden that no one else seems to comprehend. And perhaps that's my new normal. Perhaps I'm the only one now, resolving issues one day at a time. I can't stop thinking about that day. I'm wondering whether there was anything I could have done differently. Perhaps I might have communicated more clearly that I simply needed someone to listen. All of this would not have occurred. Or perhaps it was unavoidable. Perhaps they couldn't look past their own fear and would have done this regardless of how I said it. I'm not sure, and I might never find out. I just know that I am now the one left to face with the consequences. I am asking the internet now. I chopped them all off. Am I the jerk? Because that seems like my only remaining option from where I'm sitting. What's the purpose, really, if I can't trust the individuals who were meant to support me? To cheer myself up, I won't keep them around any longer. I need people in my life that care about me and don't view me as a problem that has to be solved. And it's okay if it means working alone for the time being. I might be prepared to let them back in someday. Perhaps once enough time has gone by, I'll be able to reflect and view things in a different light. However, I'm still upset, still wounded, and still carrying that $10,000 reminder of their assistance as of right now. When I said enough is enough, was I the asterisk hole? Sincerely, I don't believe I am. However, I'm willing to hear your opinions.